the number of notches and the distance between them, and then the shape of the ends of the strips, whether they're beveled or flat. Though in some cases there is complete overlap between the first three of these categories, well, the last, the calligraphic features, can sometimes be relatively subjective. And so there's a point at which content already comes into play when you're just sorting these strips into the text into which they belong. Then after all this sorting, there still remain the enormously complex task of ordering the strips within each text, piecing broken strips back together, and transcribing and reading the graphs, all of which to a certain degree has to take place simultaneously. To make a long story short, after some 5 years of work on all this, the Guodian Museum finally published in 1998 their edited volume with the materials sorted and arranged into 16 texts, complete with photographs, transcriptions, and some rudimentary footnotes. And needless to say, they had only just begun to solve most of the problems. Many of the texts were only arranged into blocks of contiguous strips, with a definitive order between these larger blocks yet to be established. And then some of the blocks themselves later proved to be not so internally contiguous after all. And moreover, readings were not offered for many of the characters that were identified, and then some of the graphs couldn't even be rendered into modern equivalents at all. And for the rest of us, this is when all the real work began. Now, the true script in which these texts were written was, of course, a regional variant of a Chinese script that remained ununified prior to the Qin unification, when the Qin script was established as orthodoxy. And these are the so-called scripts of the 6 states, Liu Guo Wen Zi. These regional variants were already largely unrecognizable to most scholars by the early Han Dynasty, and were generally referred to as the ancient script, or Guwen. We previously had some knowledge of the true script through the various legal, divinatory, and other texts among the Baoshan manuscripts, which date to roughly the same time. But the Guodian manuscripts in some ways presented themselves as something of a Rosetta Stone for deciphering the true script, at least those characters that we didn't understand, especially for those texts that have some received counterparts. At the same time, though, they presented just as many problems as they solved. Now, I just alluded to a couple of different steps involved in the process of reading these texts, right? Deciphering the graphs and then actually reading them. And I want to take you through that process in just a little more detail. And let's start with a simple example. On the left, you have this graph, which, based on prior knowledge of the true script, it was easy enough for the text arrangers to identify the constituent elements of the graph as Shen over Xin, and that's what this didn't come through in this version of the PowerPoint. But you can imagine a graph with a Shen theta Shen over a Xin, the heart radical on bottom. That's what this graph translates into as the modern equivalent rendering. But after you get that rendering, then comes the second step. Well, how do we read the graph, which as a whole has no modern equivalent and doesn't appear in traditional dictionaries? And in this case, the context and textual comparison made it abundantly clear that this is the graph for the word ren, or humanity, with Shen functioning as a phonetic element and Xin as the radical, although some would argue that Shen also has some function in the character, as significance to the character itself, the idea of humanity as a kind of fully embodied virtue. And of course, determining what readings are possible involves a whole bunch of historical phonological issues that I'm not even going to try and delve into here. Now, I want to run you quickly through a somewhat more complex case, one that will speak to not only some of the complexities involved in the process, but also one that will point to the value of studying these texts at this level and the implications they hold for reading received texts as well. And I'll begin with a couple of received texts. The first example is passage from the 20th year of Lord Zhao of the Zuozhuan. That according to traditional interpretation says something like, the Marquis of Qi was suffering from ringworm and subsequently developed malaria, and after a year he was still not cured. And then the passage goes on to record a dialogue arguing for the possible reasons that the Marquis was inflicted with such a terrible set of illnesses. Now, the same graph is recorded again in a couple times in the Yanzi Chunqiu, once in the outer chapters where it parallels the Zhuozhuan pretty much word for word and was probably copied directly from it. but also again in the inner chapters where there are some differences in wording. My question here is not so much how does ringworm develop into malaria, which is a pretty good question, but why is the word for malaria represented by two entirely different graphs that bear no phonological connection with each other whatsoever, right? The Shan on the one hand and Nuya on the other. I'll skip over this. And if we look at quickly the definitions in the Han Dynasty etymological dictionary, the Shuowen, we see that it defines Nuya as something like intermittent chills and fever, or intermittent fever and chills, which are indeed symptoms of malaria, and as a combination of the signifiers for illness and abuse, with the latter also functioning as its phonetic element. And then its definition of Shan is similarly one of having this sort of malarial fever, with the graph made up of the disease signifier and the Zhan phonetic. And then it quotes the very Zuozhuan passage that we just cited. I think there are three things worth noting here. Right, the first is that the definition for Shan comes right after the definition for Nuye in the Shuowen. Second is that Shan is defined in terms of Nuye, and thus in effect wholly subsidiary to Nuye. And third, it's further defined in terms of the authority of the Zuozhuan passage, almost as if that's where the definition itself derives from. And the funny thing is that the annotations to the Zuozhuan that gloss Shan as Nuye, in turn, cite the parallel passage in the Yanzi Neipian as evidence. So it's as if the entire definition of this word, Shan, stemmed from the parallelism of these two passages alone. Now, it's certainly not impossible that two phonologically distinct words came to represent the same illness or same set of symptoms, but it'd be nice to see some more examples demonstrating this. Now, the same story appears in the Shanghai Museum manuscripts in a text entitled Jingong Nue. And as you can see, the first couple of lines in this version of the story pretty closely parallel what we have in the Yanzi Neipian version. And as you can see, the graph read Nue, right, the sixth from the top, right here, is made up of the illness radical on the left, and on the right a combination of a tiger over mouth. And the latter combination understood here to be the graph Nue, Nue Daida Nue, meaning to abuse or injure. But let's take a closer look at this graph and the elements that make it up. And I'm not going to get into it, don't have time to get into the etymology of the graph for Hu, which is essentially derived from a pictograph for a tiger, and which, when appearing as the element in other characters, was often abbreviated to just the tiger's head. Now in the Chu script, this element more often than not appears as a phonetic, as can be seen in the examples in this slide. And the left graph of Hu and the right graph He, in those it appears it stands as a kind of secondary phonetic element. And in the middle graph, which is usually read Wu, first person pronoun, it's unquestionably the phonetic element. And there's yet another graph in the Chu script that's commonly used to stand for the interrogative or prepositional particle Hu, and that is the graph of Hu over Ko, right, tiger over mouth, in which, although the Shuowen suggested might also be a Hui or combined meanings graph, the Hu element is almost certainly represented the phonetic. And in any event, this graph was almost always read Hu, as the examples here attest to. But now here's the interesting part. As you can see, the graph for Hu is exactly the same as the graph for Nue, abuse or injure, seen here as the phonetic element in the malaria graph from the Jingong Nue passage. Now, how is that? Well, according to the Shuowen, oops, that didn't come out quite right. According to the Shuowen, the graph Nue, the abuse or injure, has the tiger head graph as its signifier, and its feet or claws turned back to snatch a person. And so it's basically a Hui graph. And it states that it has the ancient script form that looks like that, something like a tiger with possibly a mouth signifier below. And the idea is that whether it's a tiger with claws or one with a mouth full of presumably sharp teeth, it all works together to form a combined meanings graph that stood for the idea of to abuse or injure. But we've already seen how this graph of tiger over mouth stands for the phonetic Hu in Chu bamboo scripts. And so are there any instances where it stands for Nue as well? And indeed, there's at least one in the text, Gu Cheng Jia Fu, where we have this Lord Li was lawless, Wu Dao, and abusive toward the Bai Yu, Nue Yu Bai Yu. Given the context and wording, I think there's relatively little doubt that the graph here should be read Nue. And as you can see, the graph Nue is exactly the same, in the same form as what elsewhere reads Hu. So, given the dual function of this graph, read either as a Hui graph Nue or as the Xingsheng, right, radical plus phonetic graph of Hu, the potential for misinterpretation is boundless. And that brings us back to the Jingong Nue graph. Should it be read, indeed, it should be read as a graph Nue for malaria, as all interpreters have thus far assumed, given that that's the graph that appears in the parallel Yanzi text. Or could we read it as a graph with the illness radical and a Hu phonetic? And I would in fact suggest the latter and propose reading it as the word Gu, which the Shuowen defines as a long or chronic illness, 久病也, which is often written with the gu, jian gu de gu, rather than the gu phonetic. And I think that plays off, well, in the sense of gu as entrenched, or that's an illness that's chronic or hard to cure. And as shown here, the gu and hu were nearly identical in sound, and there are also some examples of interloaning between the two phonetic series, which I won't get into. And so phonologically, it all works out, or at least until Bill tells me it doesn't. So the question is, how does it work in the text? And it turns out quite well, right? So we have on the right, again, Lord Jing suffered from some kind of parasitic skin disease, and moreover, it became chronic, not getting better for over a year. Right, it makes perfect sense, right? The last phrase, not getting better for over a year, describes in concrete terms just how chronic this illness was. And with this reading, we don't have to worry about how ringworm could possibly have developed into malaria. So what that would all mean, of course, is that the Yanzi redactors, or perhaps an early copyist of the passage, eventually mistook the reading of this graph as Nue rather than Gu, and then wrote Nue with a more customary form that we now see in the Nepean version of the text. So the reading of Gu makes sense within the context of this text, but what about within the context of other texts? In the Shanghai Museum strips, we also find a very interesting passage in the text Rongcheng Shi, which discusses a point in history when people have become bitter and various illnesses, various sorts of illnesses have arisen for the first time. And then it immediately goes on to enumerate these ill people as the mute, the deaf, the lame, the hypothyroidic, the hunchbacked, etc. And now it's clear that the adjective preceding the word illness is a general term that has nothing to do with malaria. And the editor of this manuscript does transcribe it as Nue, as in cruel or abusive, Nue da Nue. Which plausibly works to describe the various sorts of illnesses or disabilities described below. But that combination of nueji, and where the nue is the nue da nue, is more or less unattested in preaching literature. But if we read the Rongcheng Shi graph, despite the absence of the illness radical, as gu rather than nue, it makes perfect sense, as all the illnesses that it describes are certainly long-term, entrenched illnesses or disabilities. Now, the reason that the reading of Guji is so appealing is that it appears often in early texts and in similar contexts. And I give a number of examples here in which Guji is written several different ways. First, to cite just one very clear example from a somewhat later text, the Jingui Yao Lue. If a chronic illness is complicated by a sudden illness, you should first treat the sudden illness and then treat the chronic illness. And then the one I want to concentrate on here comes from the Sangwen chapter of the Li Ji, there on the right, which says, the bald don't ceremonially remove their caps, the hunchback don't bare their shoulders, and the lame don't ritually stomp during mourning. It's not that they're not grieved, but rather because their bodies have chronic disabilities and they can't completely fulfill the ritual requirements. They're gu written with the metal radical. Now, what's interesting about this passage is that it is it precisely parallels the types of lifelong physical disabilities that we just saw described by what I would argue is the very same term in the Rongcheng Shi. I'll go ahead and skip over these other examples. And so let's finally get back to the original Zuozhuan passage. If we see that the Nue in the Yanzi inner chapters resulted from a misreading of Gu that was written as a Hu phonetic over Ko, then what are we to make of the Shan graft that appears in the Zuozhuan? And the answer is actually quite simple. And let me see if moving my cursor will help. It doesn't turn into, I can't use that trick on this computer. But anyway, the two graphs on the left here are both Zhan, and the graphs on the right are both Gu. Right? In either case, the presence or absence of the horizontal line doesn't affect the meaning. So you can readily see how if the horizontal line of Gu were written just slightly off the center, the graph could easily be misinterpreted and then miscopied as the graph for Zhan, and thus the phonetic in the graph for Gu easily turns into the phonetic for the graph for Shan, a character that I would argue never actually existed in the first place. But one naturally asks, where else might the character Shan appear? And there are, in fact, only 3 other instances of this graph to be seen in early texts. And all of them are problematic. The first 2 I won't get into here, but simply let you know that they have nothing to do with malaria. And the third example from the Han text, the Qianfu Lun, is even clearer. In treating an illness, if you don't get the true medicine, the illness will gradually grow more severe. The illness will daily get more entrenched, and you'll die. And I think the Shan is clearly an error for Gu, and a reading of malaria, or even the symptoms of intermittent fever and chills, just wouldn't make any sense in this context. So in sum, seeing the graphs Nue and Shan as potential misreadings or graphic errors for Gu, or representing the word Gu or chronic illness, can resolve a number of problems and ambiguities in quite a number of different passages. And so this is just one example of where excavated texts can give us some valuable clues in rereading problematic passages in the received tradition. And it should also give you a sense of just how difficult it can be to correctly read and interpret the excavated texts themselves, and how we're still continually revising our readings and as new materials come out of these texts and they're read against one another. And even then, as you can see, it's rarely a simple matter of where the answer just stares you right in the face. Right? You have to take all the evidence all kinds of different clues into account. And of course, my reading here, though I think it has a lot going for it, might well prove to be incorrect. So anyway, there's my example involving the deciphering and reading of graphs on the strips. But now I want to talk a little bit more about the ordering of the strips themselves. As even in Guodian, where most of the manuscripts appear to be complete, the ordering of them is still far from certain. Now, of course, changes in the ordering of strips could also potentially involve reassignment of strips to different texts. In those cases where the dimensions of strips belonging to different texts are exactly the same. So again, especially in these texts of 32.5 centimeters in length, these 4 here. But there are enough subtle, yet for the most part identifiable differences in calligraphy between the texts that, to my mind, even for these strips, assignment is not that much of an issue. But the need for reordering of strips within the text is an entirely different matter. And it didn't take long after the manuscripts were first published for scholars to begin offering suggestions for reordering. And not only some of the larger blocks of text, but in some cases of strips within the groupings that the editors had already more confidently identified. The most celebrated early example of this is no doubt Guoyi's reworking of part of the text entitled Chengzhi Wenzhi, showing, among other things, that the strip 1 of that text should actually follow strip 30, a move that immediately rendered nonsense of the editor's original title for the text, given that the ostensible first 2 characters actually came at the end of a sentence. And so there are a variety of factors that go into determining the strip order for texts with no received or excavated counterparts, including such things as general syntactic flow, shared content or parallel structures between strips, sometimes rhyme, or occasionally comparable lines from other early texts. And once again, sometimes linkages between strips are obvious, other times not at all. One relatively conspicuous connection that the editor somehow managed to miss is that between strips 27 and 12 of Zun De Yi, two parallel chains of inevitability that would clearly seem to belong together. And I'll just let you look at that. I don't have to read through it. Actually, some of these, not all the images came through here either, apparently, but the square should be another graph in there. Now, while it's not inconceivable that two such closely parallel sentences could have been separated in the text, given how they just happen to fit together from the end of one strip to the beginning of the next, would seem to make it all but certain that these two strips belong together. Other connections, however, are much harder to spot, especially where the previous connections already made by the editors have been taken as more or less established. And take the following lines from the strips 29 through 30 and 22 through 23 of Chengzhi, originally titled Chengzhi Wenzhi, first read in their original arrangement. All right, so 君子虽有其恒，而可能终之为难， and 君子曰急之，行之不急，未有能伸之者也. Now the thing is that while both sets of lines are slightly awkward as they stand, they're not so problematic as to have caused anyone to suspect the validity of their internal connections. And any attempts to reread them have at most involved only reparsing of phrases and not any reordering of the strips themselves. We could read them something like, the nobleman says, although, reading way here is sway, although one may have persistence, the difficult thing is being able to bring it to completion. Right? It seems to kind of make sense. And then the second, perhaps a little more awkward, the nobleman says, treat it with urgency, right? Kind of an abrupt imperative, followed then by the rest of the statement, there has never been one who could make it have a deep impact without practicing it with urgency, which also kind of seems to work. Closer inspection, however, reveals a much more plausible set of connections between these strips. So first, 君子曰：虽有其恒，而行之不急，未有能伸之者也. So the nobleman says, though one may have persistence, there has never been one who could make it have a deep impact without practicing it with urgency. And then strips 22 through 30, 君子曰急之可能，终之为难. The nobleman says, to treat things with urgency may be possible, but to bring them, it's difficult to bring them to conclusion. And this also is a rearrangement which, if correct, at the same time reveals a whole new logical structure for the text as a whole that really revolves around these three levels of heng, ji, and then zhong. Now it gets even more problematic when you have strips that are broken in two and perhaps even have portions missing. And in these instances, you really have to check the photographs of the original manuscripts carefully and figure out exactly how many graphs may be missing from key points. Now, for those who can deal with the technology, Photoshop has actually become a pretty useful tool for, pretty useful piece of software for piecing manuscripts back together. Now, I'm not one of those people, but to give you an example, there's a recently published Shanghai Museum text called 仿物流行, for which there's actually two manuscript versions, both with parts missing. And when I offered up a strip order that I thought could make sense of the text and fully account for all the strips in both manuscripts, one of the graduate students at Fudan University photoshopped the original photos of the strips in accordance with my order to see if it all fit together, which really turned out to be a great thing for me because it demonstrated quite visually how it all worked out. And here's the result. See, the A version is pretty much a complete text. There's only a few missing strips, but the nature of the text makes it so it's just determining the order on the basis of that version alone is very, very difficult. The second version is in quite a state of disarray, and you can see there's three strips that are actually missing entirely from the text. Now, if you were to blow this up, though, you could see where all the tying strings line up, and then you can get a clear sense of just how the text line up and see how many characters might be missing, and to see if these, how A and B work together, and you can finally come up with a final strip order. And I've seen these guys work with silk manuscripts not too long ago, where they're in real time, where they're, I taking fragments of the reworking Mao Wang Dui, and what they're able to do with this technology is really pretty amazing. But speaking of Photoshop, unfortunately, it seems like the editors of the original Guodian publications may have engaged in some without letting anybody know. This next slide shows the top portions of several strips from the manuscript entitled Zun De Yi. Now, if you look closer, you see something a little strange, and ignore the pencil mark for now. Right here you have a couple of unusually straight lines, right? And then, well, you could perhaps argue that this resulted from having to take the photos in segments due to equipment limitations. The fact is that the vast majority of Guodian strips have no such segmentation marks. You'll further observe here, it's hard to see on this photograph, but slightly above the above that mark, you can see that the strips fragments don't. It seems like there's two fragments that don't quite line up. Here you can see there's obviously difference in saturation between these two parts. And then in these strips here, it seems like more obvious signs of breakage, especially right here. But the funny thing is that if you look at the tables at the back of the volume, every single one of these strips is assigned only a single excavation number. So there's no indication at all that these strips may have been pieced back together from broken strips. So nobody beyond the Jingmen Museum ever thought to try and see if anything might have been pieced together incorrectly, even though the ordering of Zun De Yi is an issue that's is really as messy an issue as any of the manuscripts in the corpus. But as I was going back over this text a couple months ago, I discovered something really startling. Let's take a look at two of the strips in the original transcription. So first, for strips 22 through 23, you have 节不为其民必乱而民有为乱矣, and then something like 语言不弱可从而不可及也. So something like Jie, obviously the last evil king of the Xia dynasty, never called upon his people to wreak havoc, but they wreaked havoc nonetheless. And then something like he thus, or whatever that character might stand for, Yuan, could not compare to who knows. He could follow but not catch up. Something like that. And now Li Ling suggested the graph tentatively rendered Yuan is probably just a slight corruption of the character shou, right, receive, and might here read as Zhou, or the last evil king of the Shang dynasty. But then what would that mean, that Zhou could not compare with Jie? Right? None of it made any sense. Now, if you look at strips 19 through 20, again, 可学而不可移也, 可教而不可敌其民, 而民不可执也. Sorry, none of the created characters made it onto this version of the PowerPoint. So, and then this again is very difficult to understand. Reading something like one can learn but cannot doubt, one can teach but not guide the people, and the people cannot be stopped. It doesn't, unless you really creatively reread some of the characters, it's really hard to make any sense out of it. But now look what happens when one switches the tops of these two strips. First, with strips 28 to 23b, you get three perfectly parallel phrases, right? It can be studied but not emulated. It can be taught but not matched up to. It can be followed but never caught up with. And then likewise, two parallel phrases in strips 23a through 20b. King Jie never called upon his people to wreak havoc, but they wreaked havoc nonetheless. King Zhou failed to guide his people. In the end, they could not be stopped, could not be controlled. So such uncanny parallelism in both reconstituted strips leaves little doubt that these original strips were indeed incorrectly pieced together. And if that's the case for these two, then there may also be others as well. And I have, in fact, identified two other pairs of strips in the manuscripts that I think are likely should have their top portions switched. The case is not quite as clear as this one, but and by doing so, I think finally start to come up with a reasonably coherent order for the text Zun De Yi as a whole. Now, the thing is, this discovery comes 12 and a half years after the manuscripts were initially published, and that just gives you an example of how many problems still remain in trying to put these texts back into order. We've got about 6 minutes left.
Don't have much time.
Okay. Well, I've concentrated on some of the more technical issues in reading these texts, and there's really a whole host of issues involved in making any interpretive decision in these texts. And for one, none of the tasks involved in reading these manuscripts can wholly be separated from any of the others. Right? For instance, the transcriptions of questionable graphs can be influenced by readings assumed from context. Strip order is as much determined by transcriptions and readings as the latter are influenced by the former, and so on. So as soon as one parameter changes, the whole balance of textual equations shifts along with it. Now, the various tasks of interpretation are at once made both much easier and yet in some ways more complicated in those cases where where the text has a received counterpart. Easier because many of the answers are already given, and complicated because not all those answers are necessarily correct. And I'm going to skip over some of this broader theoretical discussion, but just mention that the way one reads excavated texts against their received counterparts is often as much a matter of psychological predisposition as anything else. Now, I've talked before, and really Qiu Xigui preceded me in explicitly addressing this issue, about the need to avoid two kinds of psychological extremes in reading excavated manuscripts against their received counterparts, right? One of which I term 喜新厌旧, right? Delighting in the new and detesting the old, and the other 忠贞不渝, kind of faithful to the end. And by the latter, I mean the tendency to explain away all variants in the excavated manuscripts so as to somehow make them conform with the traditional received readings. And by the former, the opposite tendency of seizing on excavated variants to come up with novel readings no matter how strange or shocking they may be. And I don't really have time to get into any specific examples, but I will note the psychology of delighting in the new may be particularly prevalent among certain Western sinologists. I'm not going to name any names. But part of the reason for this, what gives them license to be so creative, is the idea that we should apply the classical Western textual studies rule of lectio difficilior. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly. As a first principle to the study of Chinese manuscripts. And that is to say, the rule that when you have two possible variants, the more obscure or difficult to understand is the probable original. The rationale being that the difficult readings are more likely to have been changed by editors into something easier to understand than the reverse. Now, this may indeed be generally a sound principle worth keeping in mind, but I would argue that you can easily get into trouble when you apply it, when you apply this principle to Chinese texts. Because essentially it primarily addresses only the issue of willful scribal alteration, which is in fact only one of the two major forms of textual corruption that actually occur in Chinese texts. And as Wang Niansuen put it a long time ago, all such errors can be divided into two major categories. Right? You have on the one hand copyist errors, 传写讹托, and on the other hand you have willful alterations, 平易妄改. And given the rather unique features of the non-alphabetic Chinese script, with its large quantity of easily confused graphic forms and the prevalence of interloaning, it's often just as common that a scribe unintentionally changes a graph that could be easily understood in context into one that in fact becomes more difficult or obscure. And such is frequently the case in the Guodian text, where, to quickly cite a couple of the simplest and most obvious examples, for example, the characters for tian and are almost indistinguishable, and in the true script, and are often inadvertently mixed up for one another. And on the phonetic side, you sometimes see, for instance, let's say where you have a relatively complex graph, at least in terms of the number of strokes, shou, substituted for a simpler graph that already existed, shou to guard. There's an example from the Laozi. So these are two obvious examples where if you get yourself in trouble, if you were to try to apply the rule of lectio difficilior, at least without any sort of common sense. Now, indeed, the striking thing about that rule is that traditional Chinese philological work has tended to proceed on the opposite assumption. That is to say that the more sensible reading will in most cases prove to be the correct one. Whereas to some degree the rule of lectio difficilior serves to make as much nonsense out of the text as possible. Now, there will certainly be cases where, given all the evidence, that principle should be held to apply, but it's also a principle that must be weighed against its converse. The idea that difficult readings are also, by a similar but opposite logic, more unlikely to have been in the original text. That is to say that the wording of the text as it was first written must have made some sense. And that also brings me to a final point of caution. As I mentioned at the outset, I've translated all these texts into English, and really the process of translation itself, all its subtleties of achieving fidelity and readability notwithstanding, is really the easiest part of the whole job. Once you've managed to come up with an interpretation of the text, translating that interpretation into English is relatively straightforward matter. But whether we're talking about interpretation or translation, one really has to always be on guard against the temptation to make more sense out of the text than the evidence really allows for. I've gone back to some of my manuscript translations that I finished years ago, and I look at the original Chinese text and look at the English translation that I came up with for it, and I think to myself, wow, that was pretty clever of me. But did I really have the evidence to make that much sense out of the text from which I derived that translation? And so the creativity in the act of translation itself can often help in making false sense of a text that doesn't really hold together in the original language quite the way one makes it appear. So there's that one always has to guard against. At the same time, however, I think one doesn't want to abandon that creative drive in interpretation to begin with, because it's precisely that desire to make better sense of the text that leads us to perhaps find real evidence for solutions that would not otherwise be immediately obvious to us. And so we always have to keep that balance in mind when reading and translating early Chinese texts, whether excavated or received. And on that point, I'm going to bring this talk to a conclusion. I wanted to wish everybody a happy Chinese New Year, and thanks for coming out.